emphasize certain things. So 2017 was the year of the teacher. In 2018 it was the year of values-driven learning. In 2019 it was the year of the learner. And as we go on the year 2020 was the year of functional schools. And this year was the year of values-driven leadership. Now you take all those components and not forgetting anything, but schools are asked to have activities and promote these themes. So in the first year we were supposed to have activities and educational and development for educators. And then we were supposed to look at the values, right? And how, if we couple all those things together, start to fix things. Because our attitudes will surely have changed. If I can change one mind, then I've changed quite a bit. I've done my job. If I've changed two minds, then I have done an awesome job. Right? And that has always been I was principal in Hanover Park. And the types of things that happened in Hanover Park was atrocious. And I had to tell myself that I'm making a difference. Now, I used to tell the kids also, you don't know, unlike somebody that's on a production line, you do not know if you've been a success or not. Unless that child comes back to you and say, you know, man, that day when you told me this, I actually listened, and thank you for telling me this, it really changed my perspective. And unless a guy manufacturing these little tablets, at the end of the day, he says, oh, he's a 4 years old, I've been successful in 8 out of 10, so I'm 80%. Correct. So, teachers, it's very difficult to know if you made a difference or not, but believe you me, you have definitely made a difference. So, there's 4 pillars of the TPP strategy. It's leadership, it's change mindset for the educators, it's growth mindset. You know, the power of yet, I haven't succeeded yet. The power of opportunity, of giving them, the children, another opportunity, making them realize that they can make mistakes, and they're allowed to make mistakes. And let's take it from here and grow the growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. Oh, I can't do this, miss. How many teachers, children have come to you, Olivia? Man, I can't do this. Right? But we need to change that mindset to a growth mindset. I can't do it yet. If you show me how, with your guidance, I will succeed. Right? So we need to change that particular thing. We have the change mindset, we have the growth mindset, and we have values-based education. Now, the WCED has identified 6 core values of the organization. They are caring, competence, accountability, responsiveness, integrity, and innovation. And that, in a nutshell, is, I think, what's good in the Western Cape education today. That is, for me, is a driving and a game changer. Should we get that right? And we all, I believe, and I'm passionate about it, we need to buy into that philosophy. I bought into the philosophy. Whenever I meet with my principals, there's something on the agenda about that. When I go and engage with them, it is, let's see, how are we doing and progressing into that. So that's all in theory. But I guarantee you, and Olivia's going to agree with me, sorry to put me on you, Olivia. The WCED is a talk show. The people on the ground will tell you that the WCED don't live their values. They don't care about the principles. It's this on that. We want this document, we want that document. You get back of the knuckles, the tone of the mail that comes from head office is not one of the caring organization. You are asked for request for information, the RFIs. You have information request from one component, and another component asks you for the same information, and they want it like yesterday. So the department is not living up to their transform to form strategy. Yes, in theory it works. Yes, in schools that are implementing it, it works. But from head office perspective, it's not. Unfortunately, from my perspective, from the way I'm standing, the WCED, and I can understand why, the Attorney General has been around for the past 2 or 3 years. And we've become a compliance-driven organization, where everything is about compliance. Are the registers there? Are everything is on duty? Are the children in attendance. Are the safety policies here? I have recently just concluded my appraisal of all my principals. Excuse me, indulge me in this. And I'm a bit very I'm disappointed in the WCB because of that. We all need to be appraised, and I believe in the system. We have what we call at schools is school self-evaluation system. And coupled to that, there's a school improvement plan. And then linked to that, we have the principal's work plan. And these are based on 7, what do they call them again? Focus areas. Right? The SSE and the SIP is based on 7 focus areas. And then they come at the end of everything, they say your work plan needs to be aligned with the school self-evaluation. It needs to be aligned with the SIP. Yet, the document that they give for the work plan don't really speak to the SIP. There's different criteria and different headings. And it's very difficult to pluck one from the other. So I had a conversation with the designer of the portfolio, and this was my question to her. I said, now, what's the core function of any institution? Teaching, learning, and the delivery of learning. That's your core function. You've got to teach and you've got to learn. Yet, in none of my principles work plan did it speak to teaching, how educators will be developing, how the results will be improved. Why? Because the school self-evaluation and the school improvement plan is based on certain statements that are made, and you need to rate yourself on that. And the statements are all about compliance. Are the educators on time? And if you rate yourself a 2, it says need improvement. So you need to improve the attendance of the educators. Or something. So I said, is there any question pertaining how are you going to improve the results? No. So the core function, their focus, when I say they, I shouldn't say they, our focus is what? We're looking at compliance issues more than we're doing. I spoke earlier about the reading. How many of our children cannot read with understanding? Yet none of my principals have in their work plan how they're going to improve the reading at the school. Simply because the questions and statements aren't made prior to that and the build-up to their work plan. So that becomes a compliance document and never referred to again. So it's a paper exercise. So a lot needs to be fixed. I can go on and on and on, but I'm very passionate about that. I'm trying to engage with the relevant persons so that we can change the outlook and make the work plan of the educators or of the principals more relevant to link the various aspects of it. So, in a nutshell, I'm going to wrap up here now. I know it's taken more than my time, much more than my time. But thanks for listening. Thank you, bye.
Thank you, Rodney. I would like to ask if there are any other people, any other educators, or even if you're not an educator, who would like to, share some of what, some of the 2 questions that we had put to our 2 main speakers from the audience this evening. If there are, we will allow time for questions as well. But we want to also get Jacques and Ashley to engage with some of what was shared this evening. So please indicate. I see
I don't want to hold them, so I'm really excited to listen to Jacques and Ashley. What were the 2 questions so that we just again?
So the first question that was put to Tamika was what works in education, and the second one was what needs to be fixed. And of course, Rodney deviated from those factors.
Yeah, the answers are very deep and complex. First, we need to know what is education, and then secondly, where it starts. And obviously, starts right when a mother gives birth to a child, the first cultural exchange. So we need to look at what are the support And so now I'm going to say nothing more.
Thank you. Yeah. We need people to talk. So I would encourage you, if you did want to speak, please come to the microphone because the sound technician needs you to be vocal in your speech. But I want to hand over to our two esteemed guests this evening. Which one of you would like to go first? Good evening, John.
Good evening, everybody. It's a real joy and a privilege to be with you in this conversation, and to be with Natalie and with Ashley. Sure. How to reflect on some of the input that's been given. I'm inspired by the desire to be inspired, Tanika. The fact that you spoke to that and you worked with that, even as you describe yourself as a person who's just come into the space. Yes, you might be in this particular form of teaching and learning for a year and a half. You've been in the bigger landscape. I think that's very powerful, because where do we begin if you're not personally inspired? I'm very interested, Rodney, in your reflection of being able to put the vision and the intention out there, and then adopt a critical view to say, but it's not working. Because of compliance, and what sits under there is fear. And what robs us of our inspiration? Our fear of not being compliant, which I suppose goes down to not feeling valued or respected or trusted. So there's so many things that we can pick out. And what I'm interested in relation to how we were briefed for this evening is how we locate your reflections and maybe other reflections that you're still sitting with as other people sitting here in this parish, and in this parish's desire to make a contribution in the education landscape. So I'm wondering, do you see inspired educators and learners in this community, and where do you see them? Do you see teachers and principals struggling with compliance and operating fearfully and rigidly in accordance with sort of very, very deterministic criteria that robs them of their spirit in this community? What else do you see happening here, and what does that make you begin to think about in relation to your role? So those would just be some of my initial opening comments to get more from you, actually, because I'm trying to listen for, okay, so what is the experience here? How is the perspectives that we've been offered? How do they show up here? And how does that begin to help this community think about its role? Because I think in our preparation conversations we agreed that what St. Philip's maybe needs to do is to understand its context well, and then maybe Ashley and I can talk to different lenses and ways of understanding that context. But it's important, certainly for me, because I'm also still very new to Cape Town, to understand your stories and your experience deeply.
Thank you, John. Ashley.
Yeah, sure. I think we have decent people in the room. I think that if you've come, then maybe it is because you care about what's going on in education, you care about justice or transformation or people having what is fair, having what is right, having experiencing dignity in education. So I think we're decent people in the room in that regard. But education is a space where there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of frustration. I sense that even from the presentations that we just made. And education is a space like that, right? And we pick up the newspaper, we read those stories about the Butler dreams, we read those stories about the not enough classrooms in which was playing year after year after year. And sometimes when we talk about these things, quintile models, funding models which don't work, fee charging education, you can kind of rattle off the whole litany of what's not right in education. And sometimes that stuff can be demobilizing in a sense. But it's also important to go there, it's also important to talk about that and to dig deep into that and to understand almost what is keeping all of that stuff together. There's a quote I like from Alan Busak, and he asked a question: why do some people have what they have, and why are others deprived of what they should have? And I think when we think about education as decent people, that is a question which we need to pose within education as a whole within South Africa, as a nation state or country, at a provincial level, at a local district or circuit level, but also to link those things back globally, because South Africa itself doesn't exist as an island. But yeah, I think maybe my invitation is to invite you into that conversation of doing the social analysis, of connecting what we're hearing through the two stories from Tanika and Rodney to what's going on more broadly in education. So we want change. We want to see people acting or responding in certain ways. We want to see students having particular experiences. But do we have the structures which actually support that? Do we have the systems in place which actually allow for that to happen? One thing that I really like, and I use this in my master's work as well, is Henry Lefebvre's idea of the production of space. So when we talk about South Africa in a, post-1994 context, like where's the new space for most people in South Africa, for most students, for most schools? Most schools are, quintile 1 to 3 schools. Most of those schools are sitting in rural spaces. Most of those schools are serving black people. Most of those schools are schools where infrastructure isn't working. Most of those schools are schools where classrooms aren't in place. So for the majority of our schools in South Africa, like where's the new space which is being produced in this post context? And I think we need to go there. We need to dig deep into that. Even when we try to link this in terms of, one can be so quick to jump to like, what do we do? Like, how do we respond, or how do we act, even as a local church or as a community of people, a community of decent people who want to contribute. But it's important also to be, so I want to make that invitation to kind of explore that a little bit more as an open.
Thank you, Ashley. So we're really being asked, I mean, as a community, and not many of our communities here this evening, but we've started to to think, to question amongst ourselves, because there's I'll give some background into the community that is in Phillips. We have it's an intergenerational community. And we have families, and we have young people who are at schools, who are at local public schools, and we have young people who are at private schools or formerly Model C schools. And so when we all come together here, it is a great diverse group of people with different expectations and with wanting to make a difference, and education is clearly the space where we are wanting to do that. But we do also, because we are an intergenerational church, there are a lot of the things that you mentioned, actually, like, that there's hurt, not only amongst our people, but there's hurt in the schools and in the spaces and places where our people find themselves. And schools haven't been great in dealing with that. I mean, is that the school's role as well? Is the school meant to be the place where all of that is being handled? I hear from teachers, that they have to be everything to everyone: the social worker, the teacher, the mother, the father, the psychologist, all of that. I mean, I don't know if I was a teacher for a short while, and I was happy to get out of that space because I just couldn't be true to what I thought I was being asked to be to the people that I was working with, because I didn't have all of these things that requires me to be useful in this space. I'm going to put it out to all of you now. Please use the questions or the opportunity to make comments, to ask more questions. Let's use our time while we have them here, and they've promised to be with us through our journey, or at least we don't know how long this journey is going to be, but they've offered to walk alongside us. So I'm handing over to you now. Any questions, comments? Yes, please come to the microphone to do so. Yes, please come to the microphone. Mark, would you like to come to the microphone?
Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. What was going through my mind when Rodney was sharing and Tanika, and the comments that you made. As I was sitting there, I was thinking, children's situation, not children, the learner's situation at home. Does the education department deal adequately with their situation at home? Because I kind of compare myself to my learners that were in high school with me, and a lot of them, they thrive, like became doctors, lawyers, and professional people. But I battled at high school, and it wasn't through lack of intelligence. There was the home situation that impacted my ability to be inspiring, to want to pass and do well. So I think the end of the question is the impact of the home situation on getting your learners to be taught by you as teachers. Must be so, in my mind at least, must be so, it needs to be, I'm sure you probably are aware of it, but what programs are in place to actually, lead children through, the learners through that home situation that they find themselves in? So that's good. Thank you for the opportunity.
Shall we take another question and then we can respond? Very silent audience.
We don't talk about the purpose of the school, the purpose of education for that matter. And I think in South Africa in particular, it was interesting, Mr. Tace, you talk about that whole idea of compliance. So it's such a diverse group of people, and it's unique to South Africa, I think. And our first thing is that we all have to be the same. So we move towards that idea of wanting to drive everyone to be the same. But I'm also highly critical of the church as a space, and it's just my own experience and how I view the church. Because I feel that the church often make that compliance such a critical part of the way that they function and operate within societies. So you walk into a church, so you're saying, for instance, this is a very intergenerational church space. But when you walk into a church space often, you find that the older generation, or even the way in which churches run, there's a particular way in which they do things, and there's a almost acceptable way that people are expected to do things. So when we talk about, we talk about the idea of reproduction of space. So for me, it's what does that mean when we want to include everyone? So when we say we want to transform, we want to change, who do we want to change? Who do we want to transform? Why should I walk into a space and want to transform others? Because then it means I make them what I think they should be. Instead of saying, this is who we are, what do we do, why are we here? And what do we do so that when we look at it, when we leave the space, we all have the same of what we need, not the same that everyone else has. I grew up on a farm, and we talk about reading and writing. My dad, we used to, and still my dad grows vegetables and fruit and things on our plot in Calisthorpe. I didn't have to read any of it. I didn't have to go sit in a classroom to learn about it. I learned it, and he learned it by working on a tobacco farm with his grandfather. And none of that had anything to do with his ability to be able to read. So when we think of, again, our unique South African situation and the different kinds of cultures that we have and the people, there's so much knowledge that we discard because we think what we need to do is go to a school and learn. We need to move into a church space and learn how to pray. But I mean, for me the question is, how do we hold the spaces that people find themselves in, like Ashley says, how do we hold that space? I mean, understand that space, and then grow within that space, and not say, listen, when I walk into a space somewhere, I need to immediately transform and change that. What am I changing? What am I transforming? And for who? Because also, if we then go back to what I said first around the purpose of education at schools. So then we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we want from education and schools? Because if we say that we want kids to have an education so that they can find jobs and so that they can be successful, then it means that we're going to perpetuate what we already have. We're going to have bosses, we're going to have workers, and we're going to have people that just kind of make it because they earn a really poor salary anyway. So we're going to perpetuate that all the time. So I think we really need to think differently around the purpose and the aim of what it is that we want for ourselves firstly, and in communities. So even the whole ideas of the WCD, it's interesting. Because who came up with those things? Did they ask the learners in the schools? Did they ask the teachers? Or did they say, listen, this is what we think should happen in schools? Was it the woman that came up with those ideas? Was it the man? Was it the white male? Because those are very important aspects that we need to think about, especially in the Western Cape. Because in the Western Cape, we have so many learners from the Eastern Cape, and I'm at the school now, and I used to be at the school in the Woodstock area, and I know as soon as the learners at primary school are done with the exams, which will happen by the end of this week, we have 2 more weeks, and nationally we've been talking about contact time. 2 weeks, almost all of those learners are not going to come to school for 2 weeks because their parents will save on transport money, they will go down to the Eastern Cape, but we're saying to schools, comply because your results have to be ready by the end of November for WCD to check so that we can decide who will pass and who will fail. So again, for me, it's that whole idea of when we talk about change and transformation and what is the purpose, what is the aim, where does it lead us to, and for who? and who does the transforming and the changing? Is it the person that comes in, that change to see what it is like the person that they so wonderfully want to transform? Or do we walk into this person and say, I'm going to change you and transform you to be something that will be compliant and that will, listen and do what we want you to do? So that again, to perpetuate the whole idea of bosses, workers, and the rest. The rest is a huge proportion of our society. I don't know if that makes any sense or that's our question.
Thank you. Right. Who wants to tackle the question around the home situation?
Mark's
Yes,
question, right?
that's right.
So I think it's a very good question about in-school factors and out-of-school factors, or what is happening in the home and the relationship between the home and the school. And I think it's not a new question, it's an age-old question in education, but it's a question which helps us to also think about those kind of social justice issues which underpin, for me, everything that we're talking about. So, we can go back. There's a document which, when people talk about this particular question, they always refer to, right? It's the Coleman report, where people thought it was going to be teachers that make the biggest difference, and what the report then said was, oh, but actually, you know what? It's actually what's happening outside of school which has the biggest difference. Although, to qualify, they did say that in the most difficult spaces, actually sending the best or the quality teachers to those kinds of spaces actually does make a difference, right? But there's also work like Jean Amion's work, where, for example, she began to look at class in education, working class schools, middle class schools, elite schools. And her work starts off like this, but then later on actually develops and she asks the question, what is education policy? And begins to say that actually, like, if we really want to cause transformation in schools, actually fighting for things like a minimum wage or a living wage might actually be more radical, might actually lead to more improvements in education and schooling. Because if parents can actually afford to feed their children, if they can afford to care for their children and look after their children, then you will have differences in the school. So now all of a sudden, fighting for workers' rights actually becomes education policy as well. You've got the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, for example, also comments on this question and says, well, the easiest thing for the school to do to kind of generate inequality is to treat every student as if they're the same. So to ignore background, to ignore race, to ignore class differences, to ignore all of those things. Just treat everyone the same. And think about some of our education policies and the language and how we talk about change in South Africa. And now Bourdieu says, for example, that's all we need to do really to generate inequality is to ignore those things. Then you've got Basil Bernstein, also in education, very kind of controversial one, but actually it's got an interesting article and talks about this idea that actually education cannot compensate for society. So if we want to solve big social problems, we actually need to fix society. And we can't expect education to almost be this like magical lever from which everything shifts and changes. At the same time, of course, education plays a role and a part in that. That's why we're all here, that's why we all say we care about education. I think that's why we're in the space, right? Because we believe it's an important space. But it's not a space which kind of, it's a cure-all, if you like that. So it's important then to think intersectorally, it's important to think in terms of what are the overlaps between all of these things. What does it mean in terms of a school, a local school, or a school district, or a department of education? It means maybe the ways in which we think about education needs to shift. Because education is always adapted, right? But who is it adapted for is a question that we don't ask. Whose language is privileged? Whose social background is privileged in the curriculum, in the content, in the pedagogy, and so on. Who is taken into account? Because it always takes into account somebody. And maybe there's a need to decenter certain things. That whole decolonial debate that many students and many people have raised over the last so many years. So yeah, this a good question from Mark and leads us into kind of, I guess, asking even more deeper questions about education.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you. I believe it's you to answer the other question.
Well, yeah, I think it's a lovely question. Why do we even have schools? I want to also pick up on Ashley's use of the word decolonial and decolonisation, and also pick up something of his challenge to ask the difficult questions and to go into the social analysis, particularly as church. Because when we look at the history of how the Anglican Church has been involved in education in South Africa, it's a very complex history. It's a very difficult story. You've got bishops, for example, and Zonderburg founded within 10 years of each other. And look at bishops today, and look at Zonderburg today, and look at the trajectory of those two schools. A very complex story. Look at bishops, look at St. George's Grammar School, for example. Look at those two stories. I'm not having a go at bishops, but I'm having a go at the construct of what resulted in the Anglican Church having now predominantly elite schools for the elite. What resulted in, what was the story around the way in which we responded to the introduction of the Untitled Education Act in the 50s and the closure of so many of our schools? Even then, it was a contested space in that certain schools were known as church schools, i.e. here at the Western Cape, schools like St. Cyprian's and Herschel and Bishops and St. George's, whereas the other schools that were closed were known as mission schools and were managed and engaged with quite differently. So the question about the challenge to ask the difficult questions sits also with us as church, as we think about the way in which we, and Ashley's absolutely right, not to come to the doing part too quickly. Because the other question I think that sits behind why do we even have schools is then to recognize that we come out of a particular tradition, and our involvement in education as an Anglican Church came out of a particular way in which schools were established. Are the colonists of the time, and we live with the imprint of that. So why do we do education? Do we do it because that we're living with that idea of what it is to educate? And is this an opportunity for us to think differently, to ask that question? And it's interesting to me that even the space from which we took the model, England, is also in itself beginning trying to use different words that are not performance, they're not around performance and the typical ideas that are associated with education, like around employment, as Enrico was challenging us to think about. But they're words like dignity, wisdom, hope, and community, for example. What would it mean for us to find our words that locates the experience of education and teaching and learning in a very different way that's honest to the complexities of the past, if we're going to explore this as church? So, yeah, I'm just sitting with the sense of the challenge of doing the social analysis and doing it in relation to ourselves as the church community, as the Christian community, as the Anglican church community, with everything that needs, to really look into the complexity of our story in order to find maybe what's going to be particularly life-giving about a new way of being involved, so we don't just make assumptions about why we do education or what it is.
Thank you, Jacques. Are there any more questions or comments? Letitia, I don't want to bounce on you, but I know you had a question. You just wanted to see where it was going. And I'm aware of time, so I want to give you the opportunity to ask the question.
Good evening. I'm Letitia. I'm a member of the Deprived Church. I am not a teacher, but I actually always wondered in terms of the education system, especially in South Africa, as many of you alluded to. We do the same thing mostly. You've got the same methods that you use, but I have a personal concern because it's actually of a family member, where I just feel, I'm not sure whether the system has failed or what, but if this individual is not wired, you can't take in anything in a formal way. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, we need some change where we can take our youth and the children who are struggling in school to understand certain concepts, but they have an ability to work with their hands and do more technical stuff. Now, in the schools as we have it now, a lot of it is focused on academics. Now, I do know that there are technical schools, but if you think of a lot of the youth, they drop out of school because either they can't cope, or it's just that they're not wired to sit and listen for hours, to lectures, but they'd much rather be doing something with their hands. And for me, I just feel that maybe just the methods that's being used, just to move away from, as you were saying, we're doing education in a certain way as was first the colonialism came in, and that's how we thought education to be. But maybe just to, I don't know, this is a very specific thing for me in terms of a different way of teaching, reaching maybe the youth who we think are just dropouts and don't want to go to school, but they actually physically have issues that's not necessarily being picked up by the teachers, and there's no avenue for them to explore in terms of, or there's not that many options for them. So, I'm not sure if I'm bringing across what I really wanted to ask, or the question I really wanted to, but it's really just around trying to capture those who have fallen through the cracks, not because they are stupid or they can't learn. It's just that what is being taught to them, it's not something that they wired, their brain can't think that way. They would rather sit and work out something so complex with their hands, but they can't read that or understand that through verbal teaching. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Letitia. We've got Catherine, I see your hand, and also Donna Sebo. Would you like to ask your question? Or do you have a response?
Or it's a stream of consciousness. But to respond to Letitia, and I think that's what I also wanted to talk to, is how whether it's children who have any issues, or not. But if you look at how a baby learns, it's always in an explorative manner. And then schools, they stop that. And so perhaps when we're reimagining what is not working, is that purpose? What are we trying to do? How are we teaching? And for what purpose at the end? Now, I'm a qualified trained teacher, specialized in ECD and foundation phase. And currently I work for an NGO, Shine Literacy. And our offices are actually at Zonneblom Boys. I went to school together in Magdalene High School, one of the leafy ones that you mentioned. And so what we're trying to reimagine, I think that deconstruction, what are we reimagining without forgetting? For me, what I'm trying to grapple with is we are quick to want to find a solution just for the schools and not thinking of the broader social, whether it's context, whether it's here in South Africa, and broadly, the inequalities are inextricably linked to how we move forward. We've got to address that. I think it's Mark. Yes. When you were talking about how you learned your farming, those indigenous knowledge systems were always wiped out. And that's the reimagining we need to be thinking of as well, is how do we then now bring back the dignity of the indigenous people into the learning space, so that it's not just an other learning space, but it's taking into effect. I'm thinking of my grandmother who was a midwife. Makulu didn't have a sub-A, but now that's completely wiped out. She cannot, and she can change the breech baby by just doing, I don't know what she does with that oil, and then she can change it. But here we need obstetrician, gynecologist to do that function. Again, these are the systems we need to be addressing when we're reimagining our education. Then the last thing, as a Shine Literacy person, that conversation on reading for meaning. I'm thinking now, is that the first point? Shouldn't we be thinking of speaking and listening? We assume that the learners are not reading for meaning. Have we done some research to really understand? Can they understand the spoken language? How deep is that understanding of just the language use before the actual decoding and encoding takes place? These are just my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Catherine?
Yes.
Yes, please come forward.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Hello everybody, panel. Good evening. I am so excited to hear, especially, your narrative on what is education and what is learning. And thank you for your input. The foundation phase was easily input that you had. And thank you. Actually, you went very deep because we are sitting with the effects of globalization, very, very neoliberal expectations on economy, on building economy, and of course, what our wonderful colonial education brought to us, but also raised the expectation for us about what education is. And so, wait, must I keep my mask on? And so, I think with my oxygen is very important. And so, how do we address hopelessness, dignity, just joyfulness in living? In knowing that what I have as a gift and what I can do is what I can bring to my life and to society. So, there's also this we need to clarify what technical schooling is and what schools of skills can bring, because technical schooling can also be difficult for learners who do not necessarily subscribe to this very colonial package of, subjects and then career and expectations and about society, what I must become and have a good job and a livelihood. So it's very important to know what can the person do, what would the person like to do, and to create environments for that. Because we must realize that also through the DOP system we have serious problems about fetal syndrome, but it does not mean that those learners or those people should just be written off and not live fulfilled lives and enjoy livelihood. And so, what environments are being created for people to discover? They might not even know what they can do, but to create environments where people can discover what they can do and what can bring meaningful living to them, responding to what you have been, you are the proponent of faith and education, coming together and bringing dignity, wisdom, hope, community. So, creating environments so that people can discover what they can do, so that they can enjoy meaning in life, so that they can realize that I can also look after myself. And I'm trying to use simple terms, I'm not trying to be academic, too academic, because life is really about what can I do and how can I be part of this? Everybody's making a living. How can I do this? And so obviously our narrative on schooling, packaged in colonial thinking, we need to look deeper. I'm not saying that there are not deep benefits in colonial schooling, but I'm saying we need to look differently at how we present schooling, how we present discovery. And I don't want to miss what I was going to say, so I wrote it down. There is an immense resource of giftedness in the church, and the collective of that and what we can bring to people, and then saying, let's discover together, because learning for me is really about discovering together. And I do want to say about ECD and early child care, where learning is so stunted, because we put you in a pram, I'm a day mother, I put you in a pram, I put you in front of the TV, because I have chores to do. So we really need to look deep at, yes, what is happening with children from birth, right to when they can experience some dignity and worth in being, and taking care of themselves. And I don't think I'm going to have to summarize anything. I hope you will think it's so okay, I thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Right now, do you have some concluding remarks, responses to the last three statements?
Okay, I can respond to. Are we concluding?
I'm aware of time, and I know that I can't keep you here too long because we are at 20 past that. So
I will respond to the issue in any case. I think I can't respond to the personal question. I can't respond to issues of literacy or for that matter even of cognition, but I will share some things that we do know about cognition, right? And in this case you can go to Vygotsky's work, Uriel's work, you can go to a number of different people who have written on this. And what we do know is that there's several of these kinds of tests done giving students pictures, with chicken and chips or whatever on there, and asking students to arrange this. And what we know that, for example, some students would arrange this with chicken and chips. Others would arrange this, this is fats, and this is carbohydrates, this whatever. Another test you can go and do, people that live by the island, for example, would arrange the seashells according to colors. it's one way to categorize. It's by color. Another group of kids would categorize it according to, for example, they put all the same colors together, but they know because they live there that those are edible ones and those are non-edible ones. So it's not about right and wrong, but what we know from all of those kinds of work is that cognition depends also on the social environment, right? And on what we have access to. And in a society like we live, also on your class position, because your class position might determine what kind of work your parents do, and that might determine what kind of language is shared in the home, and that might determine, for example, how you go about organizing the seashells and so on. So, just one way of thinking about your question, but I think when we begin to make statements or when we begin to think about broad education policies, we must be very careful. Yes, that's why I said I can't comment on certain things, for example, because I don't know a particular case about a particular student who might need, for example, special assistance. But I do know that historically in South Africa, not just South Africa, but everywhere under colonialism, there's been attempts to categorize forms of education for different kinds of people, right? So this group of people will receive technical education. This group of people will see what is so-called intellectual or academic education. Another group of people will be ghee butter producers or whatever. These ones will work with the cattle and so on. Ways to divide and rule, but also ways to kind of create long-lasting effects, social effects that are difficult to undo, like we have in South Africa. We know also in South Africa, locally, that we had a thing called the Lange Commission. And the Lange Commission, part of what happened in that commission decades ago was this proposal of why not restructure the system according to these different kinds of schools. You know, we have a stream for the more academic student, a stream for the technical, and a stream for the vocational. We also know that it was rejected by education activists at the time. But maybe even though we're so long after that now, we need to go and revisit why did they reject it. And part of the reasons why they rejected it was because who was going to go to which category? Probably going to be black, going to technical and vocational, probably going to be white, going to the more academic stream. Until the parents from bishops decide they're going to take their kids out of those schools and enroll them all en masse in the TVET institutions or whatever school of skills, then we're not going to kind of see different ways of thinking about that, right? So we need to revisit those struggles, we need to revisit why did people reject that in the first place. And some of those stuff are happening right now as we speak. In 2021, Western Cape Education Department is currently piloting in 21 schools the 3-tier system. The very system that education activists rejected because it was going to be racialized, it was going to be classed, it was going to be, here it is under our noses kind of being, or even being projected as a solution in education. So I think there's almost 2 levels to your question, and I said the one is kind of personal and I can't really respond to that, but I think when we scale it up into like education policy and how we think about managing an education system, it becomes a lot more tricky about how we think about those things and who gets affected by it. Are we also concluding?
Please.
Okay. So I know we've got a lot of threads, and I think for me it's just important to kind of bring them together in a particular way. And I think that a lot of what we speak about, we use this analogy with the high school students as well. A lot of what we speak about is out in the leaves. If you think of it, the analogy of a tree is the leaves. The funding issues, the admissions issues, the classroom issues, the language issues, all of these things are the leaves of the system. They're what we see, we recognize, we can experience it. There are structures, policies and practices which undergird those things. We can go to the Schools Act, we can look at how the Schools Act itself is racialized. It allows for race and class-based education in South Africa, right? So we didn't have time to get into that kind of stuff, but there are structures, policies and practices which undergird that. But also underneath that, someone mentioned this idea of globalization and neoliberalism. Underpinning all of that, we also have an economic system. Right? And that economic system, I like the way Du Bois put it. It's a system which is premised not only on exploitation, but on exploitation of black bodies. That's the original capital, from slavery through colonialism in South Africa, through apartheid. It's always race, it's always class, it's also always patriarchal, right? And so we have an economic system which is the foundation of all this structures, policies, practice, and belief. But we didn't get to this, and I thought that the Reverend Jacques would get to this, is asking the theological question also, since we're in the church, is what is our underlying theory of poverty and suffering? Why do we have suffering in the world? Why do we experience poverty in the world? And for me, that sits right at the roots of all of this stuff. So it's embedded in this kind of idea of why do we think this stuff exists? Is it just benign? Is it just, poverty will always be there? Is that our theology? Is that our ideology or understanding of how the world works? Or do we see, for example, these things are produced through human actions? These things are produced through choices we make. These things are produced through power imbalances in society. These things are produced through deliberate exploitation. One person dominating and another person in the position of subordination. So, if we really want to kind of create stuff, my understanding is always we need to go to those roots, and maybe there needs to be reflection on those kind of, I guess, philosophical or theological, in the church, let's use the word theological, reflections also.
The Lord will always be with us.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Sure, such important, challenging words. And you've set the stage really nicely, I think, because my closing reflection was going to be one of the, if we as church are going to enter into this space of reimagining education in the way that we've tried to come at it, that it's part of this very complex economic, social, and political tapestry in the world, with these structural influences and action and things, choices that people do that make, form, give rise to the inequality and the injustice that we experience and see. We will need to have a theology, a perspective, a conversation, an engagement with why it's like that. And our challenge in the church, I think this is my closing reflection, our challenge in the church is that we want to keep the peace too quickly. So reconciliation is the first word off our tongue, as it were, and out of our heart, and not because it's wrong. And we want to be friends, we want it to all be nice and peaceful, so we don't get into the difficult spaces that actually is highlighted so accurately for us. There's a theorist that I'm learning to appreciate and understand, and her name is Nancy Fraser, and she argues that if we're going to engage with justice, which if we just pause for a moment and remember the words of Micah 6, verse 8, to act justly, to love mercy, kindness, and to walk humbly with our God, then we must first pay attention to three particular things that give rise to the possibility of justice, and that is the economic aspect of it, the social cultural aspect of it, and the political aspect of it. And she talks about things like redistribution, recognition, and representation. And then somebody else who Ashley and I also appreciate has added to that reconciliation can't begin to emerge as something that we can work towards and establish and sustain unless we've got this interdependent, intertwined process of redistribution, recognition, and representation, all the economic, the social, cultural, and the political, all working together to, in her words, what she defines justice as parity of participation, so that the whole system needs to be restructured, reformed, so that there is economic justice, social and cultural justice, and political justice, or there is justice in each of those spaces, which then gives rise to the possibility of talking about reconciliation. And our challenge as a church is that I think we've gone into the reconciliation space without engaging those other three spaces, and ask the question of ourselves as well, as I was trying to say earlier. And if we're going to play a meaningful part in the reimagination of education, even at parish level, those lenses and perspectives have to be brought to bear. Otherwise, we're just going to be reproducing, the racialized class system that we've, in a sense, inherited and feel the pain of so deeply, and see and experience today still.
Well, thank you, Jean and Ashley. I hope that this has been the start of some more conversations. We can probably do this again a few more times, and I hope that you will be open to that, and that also more you will come. I do want to encourage you to please, if you have any more questions, I'm sure that you can either email them to me or to Daj. I think you have Daj's details, and we can share them with Ashley and John. It's customary to say thank you at the end of a session like this. So our soon-to-be new priest, Philip, will do that. Philip, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Philip Donald. And it has been a wonderful journey just emailing, meeting with you beforehand, and discussing this evening. And thank you, everybody else, for the contributions. I think it has deepened the conversation that we started. And I think there's nothing more that we could have actually asked for. So thank you for helping us on that journey. And you're getting yourself into more work, digging a deeper hole. But yeah, this is a small token of appreciation from us at St. Philip's, and I promise of more to come.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that John and Ashley would also welcome any more interaction with you if you would like. Please just remember to socially distance, and the recording will be made available from this evening, that you can certainly also get from our office. That leads me to say thank you again. Thank you for putting in the time, Tanika and Rodney for preparing, and also to all of you for being here this evening. I appreciate it. Education is one of my passions. I came here to this space from a school space, and I don't think it will ever leave me. And so I'm trying really hard to find a balance, to find that space. How do we hold that space in Jico, and what's the purpose? Because I worry for my children. I have no idea what they're going to do after school, and I don't think they know either. And it's a huge concern for me. So thank you again. Do you want to say anything more? I'm trying to not do the things that you say that we do, the church forces us to do, because I don't want to pray a blessing over you or anything like that. But I will just say, going in peace, to love and serve the Lord.